The cranberry sauce had barely been passed when my father launched his annual tradition of humiliating me in front of the entire extended family. "So, Marcus," Dad said, his voice carrying that particular tone he reserved for discussions about my career. "Still chasing that journalism dream? Writing for those little websites nobody reads?" I set down my fork carefully. 27 family members were packed into my parents' oversized dining room in their Connecticut estate. The room itself was designed to impress. Hand-painted wallpaper imported from France, a dining table that could seat 30, and a crystal chandelier that my mother claimed was once owned by European royalty. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and their various spouses all turned to watch the familiar spectacle unfold. The crystal chandelier cast prismatic light across the table, illuminating faces I'd known my entire life. Faces that now wore expressions ranging from pity to barely concealed amusement. "I'm doing fine, Dad," I said quietly. "Fine." My mother laughed, dabbing her mouth with a cloth napkin monogrammed with our family crest. "Honey, your brother just made partner at his law firm. Your sister closed a $40 million real estate deal last month. And you're, what? Typing articles for free." My brother Daniel smirked from across the table, his Yale law tie perfectly knotted. At 42, he had become everything our parents had ever wanted: successful, wealthy, and eager to remind everyone of it. His wife, Catherine, sat beside him, wearing a necklace that probably cost more than I made in a year. She looked at me with the particular disdain reserved for disappointing relatives. My sister Patricia examined her manicured nails, a massive diamond engagement ring catching the light from the chandelier above. She was 38, newly engaged to a hedge fund manager named Bradley, and considered herself the family's social ambassador. Bradley sat beside her looking bored, occasionally checking his phone to monitor whatever markets were open on Christmas Day. And then there was me, Marcus Chen, 34 years old. The family disappointment. "I've told you before," I said calmly. "I work as an investigative journalist. It's meaningful work." "Meaningful?" Dad scoffed. "You know what's meaningful? A salary, benefits, a retirement plan. Not whatever it is you do in that cramped apartment in Brooklyn, pretending to be some kind of crusader." My cousin Tyler's wife, whom I'd met exactly twice, leaned toward her husband and whispered something. They both glanced at me and laughed. It wasn't subtle. Nothing ever was at these gatherings. Aunt Helen leaned forward, her pearl necklace swaying. "Richard, maybe you should." "No, Helen," Dad cut her off. "This is for his own good. Someone needs to tell him the truth. He's 34 years old. When I was his age, I had already built 3 companies. What has he built? A blog?" The table fell silent. I could feel the weight of everyone's stares. Some pitying, some amused, some carefully neutral. "Remember when he left law school?" Daniel said, refilling his wine glass with a bottle that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Dad paid for 3 semesters at Columbia. 3 semesters. And Marcus just quit. Said he wanted to pursue truth, or some nonsense." "I remember," Mom said bitterly. I cried for a week. All those connections we'd made with the admissions board, wasted. All those networking events, the dinners with the dean, completely pointless. The embarrassment at the country club was unbearable, Dad added. Everyone asking about our brilliant son at Columbia Law, and I had to explain he dropped out to write articles about, what was it? Local corruption? "Actually," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I looked up some of his articles last week. He writes about, like, corrupt politicians and corporate scandals. Very noble, very poor." Laughter rippled through the room. Even my cousins joined in. "I saw one of them," Uncle Harold added from the far end of the table. "Something about pharmaceutical companies. Honestly, who reads that stuff? Boring as watching paint dry. No offense, Marcus, but maybe leave the business stories to actual business people." I continued eating, my expression neutral. I had learned, long ago, that engaging only gave them more ammunition. "You know what the problem is?" Daniel said, gesturing with his wine glass. "Marcus always thought he was better than the rest of us. Too good for the family business. Too good for a real career. He wanted to make a difference. He made air quotes with his free hand. How's that working out for you, little brother? I took a slow breath. I had learned, over years of these gatherings, that responding only made things worse. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to defend myself so they could tear down whatever I said. Nothing to say? Mom asked. See, this is the problem. No ambition. No drive. Just silence. I have plenty to say, I replied evenly. I just don't see the point in arguing at Christmas dinner. That's because you can't argue, Dad said. You have nothing to show for yourself. When was the last time any of us saw your name in a real publication? Not some internet blog. A real newspaper. A real magazine. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it. You know, Uncle Harold said, my friend's son started in journalism. Gave it up after 2 years. Now he's a successful marketing executive. Makes 6 figures. Has a house in Westchester. Drives a Mercedes. Maybe you should consider a pivot, Marcus. A pivot, Patricia laughed. That would require him to admit he was wrong. And we all know Marcus is never wrong. He's just perpetually unsuccessful. More laughter. Cousin Miranda, who was studying for her MBA at Wharton, chimed in. I actually looked at the economics of independent journalism for a class project. The median income is like $32,000 a year. No offense, Marcus, but that's barely above the poverty line. I mean, how do you even survive in New York on that? No offense taken, I said mildly, reaching for my water glass. See, that's the problem, Dad said, pointing at me with his fork. No fight. No fire. When I was building my business, I fought for every dollar, every client, every opportunity. You just sit there and accept mediocrity. You've become comfortable with failure. At least he's consistent, Bradley, Patricia's fiancé, added with a smirk. It was the first thing he'd said all evening that wasn't about his fun's performance. My phone buzzed again. And again. Someone's popular, Daniel said sarcastically. Probably his landlord asking for rent. Or a collection agency, Patricia added. I pulled out my phone, more to escape their stares than anything else. The screen showed 4 missed calls from the same number. A New York number I didn't recognize. There was also a text message. Mr. Chun, this is the Pulitzer Prize Board. It is urgent that we speak with you. Please call back immediately. I stared at the message. Read it again. My heart began to pound, but my face remained impassive. Years of practice at this table had taught me that much. What is it? Mom asked, noticing my expression. Did you get fired from your blog? Can you even get fired from a blog? Tyler's wife whispered loudly. More laughter. I need to make a call, I said, standing up. Oh no, Dad said firmly. You're not leaving this table. We're having a family discussion about your future. Sit down. This is important. More important than your family? That's exactly the problem, Marcus. You always think you're too good for us. Too busy with your little stories to spend time with the people who matter. Let him take his call, Aunt Helen said quietly. Maybe it's about a job. A real job. Daniel laughed. Doubtful. When has Marcus ever had a real job? You know what? Dad said, a malicious glint in his eye. Take your call, but put it on speaker. If it's so important, we should all hear it. Unless you're embarrassed about something? He was challenging me, trying to humiliate me further. He expected it to be nothing, a spam call, maybe, or something he could mock. 27 faces turned to watch, already preparing their pity or their laughter. Okay, I said calmly. I returned the call and set my phone on the table, speaker on. The room quieted as the phone rang. Once. Twice. Mr. Chun? A woman's voice, professional and warm. Yes, this is Marcus Chun. Mr. Chun, this is Dr. Patricia Hernandez, chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board. I apologize for calling on Christmas Day, but we've been trying to reach you. I'm here with several members of our committee. My father's smirk began to fade. Daniel set down his wine glass. Cousin Miranda's jaw dropped slightly. The room seemed to freeze. I'm sorry I missed your calls, I said. I've been at a family dinner. Completely understandable. Mr. Chun, I'm calling with news that couldn't wait. The Pulitzer Prize Board has completed its deliberations for the investigative reporting category. Your 12-part series on the pharmaceutical price-fixing scandal has been selected as our winner. The silence in the room was absolute. 27 pairs of eyes fixed on my phone. You're telling me I won the Pulitzer Prize? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Not just one, Mr. Chin. The vote was unanimous, something that hasn't happened in this category in 17 years. Your investigation led to federal indictments of 14 pharmaceutical executives, saved taxpayers an estimated $2 billion, and prompted the largest healthcare reform legislation in a decade. The committee was deeply moved by the scope and impact of your work. A man's voice came on the line. Mr. Chun, this is Robert Williams, Executive Director of the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. I want to add my personal congratulations. Your series has already become required reading in our investigative journalism curriculum. It represents the highest standards of the profession. My mother's face had gone pale. My father's mouth hung slightly open. Uncle Harold, who had called my pharmaceutical investigation boring as watching paint dry, stared at his plate as if hoping it might swallow him. Another voice joined. Marcus, this is Senator Elizabeth Warren. I'm on the call because I wanted to personally thank you. Your reporting was instrumental in passing the Pharmaceutical Accountability Act. You've done more for American healthcare in 2 years than most legislators do in their entire careers. Patricia dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against her plate. Dr. Hernandez continued. Mr. Chen, we'd also like to inform you that 3 major publishing houses have already contacted us about your memoir rights. Additionally, CNN, The New York Times, and The Washington Post have all submitted offers for you to join their investigative teams. I believe the highest offer is currently $3.2 million over 4 years, plus equity stakes. Daniel choked on his wine. His face turned red as he coughed, wine dribbling down his Yale law tie. Catherine patted his back, her expression frozen somewhere between shock and horror. Thank you, I said. This is unexpected. One more thing, Dr. Hernandez said. I understand from my colleague at the Nieman Foundation that you've been selected as a Nieman Fellow at Harvard for next year. And the MacArthur Foundation has asked me to pass along that you're on their shortlist for the fellowship, the so-called Genius Grant. You should expect their call within the week. My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that echoed through the suddenly silent room. We'll send formal documentation tomorrow, Dr. Hernandez continued. The award ceremony will be in May at Columbia University. Please feel free to invite your family. It would be wonderful to have them there to celebrate your achievement. Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. Thank you all. Congratulations, Mr. Chen. You've earned every bit of this. Enjoy your Christmas. The call ended. The silence in the room was deafening. I looked up at my family. My father's face had turned a deep shade of red. My mother was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. Daniel and Patricia stared at me like they'd never seen me before. Cousin Miranda's MBA statistics about journalism income suddenly seemed irrelevant. Bradley had actually put down his phone. So, I said quietly, picking up my fork. You were saying something about my blog? Nobody spoke. My phone buzzed again. I glanced at it, a text from my editor. NYT just raised their offer to $4.5 million. CNN countering. Your phone is about to explode. Congratulations, Pulitzer winner. Marcus, my mother finally said, her voice strained. We had no idea. No, I said calmly. You didn't. Because you never asked. Not once in 10 years did anyone in this family ask what I was actually working on. You assumed I was failing because I didn't have a corner office or a law degree or a real estate portfolio. Now wait just a minute, Dad started, finding his voice. No, Dad. I've waited long enough. Do you know what my investigation did? It uncovered a price-fixing scheme that was killing people. Real people. Patients who couldn't afford insulin because 14 executives decided to triple the price overnight. Mothers who had to choose between feeding their children and buying their medication. elderly people who were rationing doses and dying because of corporate greed. I stood up, my voice still calm but firm. Those executives are now facing federal prison sentences of up to 30 years each. The companies paid $4.6 billion in fines. And the legislation that passed because of my reporting will cap insulin prices for millions of Americans. That's what I was doing while you were all laughing at my little blog. We were just concerned about you, Mom said weakly.
No.
You were embarrassed by me. There's a difference. You never called to ask how I was doing. You only called to remind me of how successful everyone else was. Every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every family gathering, it was the same performance. Mock Marcus. Pity Marcus. Remind Marcus he's the family failure. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but I continued. And, you know what's interesting? While you were closing your real estate deals, Patricia, I was investigating your business partner, Harold Finch. He's one of the 14 executives I mentioned. He'll be indicted next month. Patricia's face went white. What? Harold Finch. Your partner in the Riverside Development Project. He was the CFO of Meridian Pharmaceuticals. You might want to review your contracts with him before the FBI freezes his assets. I'd estimate you have about 3 weeks. You're lying, she stammered. Am I? Check the news in about 3 weeks. I gave the DOJ a courtesy heads up so they could coordinate with the SEC. Your $40 million deal might need some revisiting. All those champagne toasts were a bit premature. Bradley's face had gone pale now, too. He started typing furiously on his phone. My phone rang again. I looked at the screen. A producer from 60 Minutes. I should take this, I said. Marcus, wait, Dad said, standing. Maybe we got this wrong. Maybe. I laughed softly. Dad, you literally called me an embarrassment to the family 20 minutes ago. Mom agreed. Daniel compared me to a failed marketing executive. Patricia called me perpetually unsuccessful. Cousin Miranda cited income statistics to prove I was barely above the poverty line. Miranda stared at her plate, her face flushed crimson. I've spent 10 years being dismissed by this family. 10 years of Christmas dinners where I sat quietly while you all took turns reminding me how disappointed you were. Do you know why I never defended myself? No one answered. Because I didn't need your validation. I knew what I was doing mattered. I knew the work was important. And I knew that eventually, the work would speak for itself. My phone kept ringing. Another text appeared, this time from Anderson Cooper personally. Heard the news. Would love to have you on AC 360 next week. Call me when you can. Marcus, Daniel said, his voice subdued. We're family. We should celebrate this together. Celebrate? I raised an eyebrow. 3 minutes ago, you were mocking me for having my landlord call. Now you want to celebrate. People say things they don't mean, Mom offered.
No, Mom.
You said exactly what you meant. All of you did. The only difference now is that you've realized I'm not a failure after all, and suddenly you want to be on my side. Suddenly, you want to share in something you spent a decade mocking. I grabbed my coat from the back of my chair. I have calls to return. Important people who actually want to talk to me about my work. My real work. The work you called boring. The work Uncle Harold couldn't finish reading because it was like watching paint dry. Uncle Harold wouldn't meet my eyes. You're leaving? Dad asked, stunned.
Yes.
I'm going back to my cramped apartment in Brooklyn. You know, where I write those little stories that apparently just won the highest honor in American journalism, prompted federal legislation, sent criminals to prison, and are about to make me wealthier than anyone in this room. Uncle Harold stood up. Marcus, think about what you're doing. Family is. Family? I turned to face him. Family is supposed to support you, believe in you, encourage you. This family has done nothing but tear me down for a decade. So let me make something very clear. I looked around the room, making eye contact with each of them in turn. I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. I'm just done. Done sitting quietly while you mock my choices. Done pretending your opinions matter to me. Done being the family punching bag at every holiday. Another text. This one for my editor. MacArthur Foundation called. You got the Genius Grant. $800,000, no strings attached. They're announcing tomorrow. You're having quite a Christmas. I read it, smiled slightly, and slipped my phone into my pocket. What was that? Patricia asked, her voice desperate. Another award? Something like that. Marcus, please, Mom said, standing.
Stay. Let's talk about this.
We were wrong. We can admit that now. The time for talking was 10 years ago, Mom. When I left law school to pursue journalism and you told me I was throwing my life away. When I published my first investigative piece and Dad didn't even read it. When I spent months living on savings while building sources, and Daniel offered to get me a job in his firm's mailroom since I wasn't cut out for anything else. Daniel looked at the floor, his stained ties suddenly very interesting. You all made your positions very clear, very consistently, for a very long time. Now that I've achieved something you can't dismiss, you want to pretend none of that happened. But I remember every word, every smirk, every pitying look, every whispered comment when you thought I couldn't hear. I walked toward the door. The award ceremony is in May, I said over my shoulder. Dr. Hernandez invited you, but I'm going to ask her to remove you from the guest list. I'd prefer to celebrate with people who actually believed in me. My editor, my sources, the whistleblowers who risked their careers to help me expose the truth. Marcus. Dad's voice cracked. I paused at the door. Oh, and Dad? You asked when you last saw my name in a real publication. Tomorrow's New York Times front page. My byline. Above the fold. They're running a piece about the Pulitzer announcement alongside excerpts from my investigation. I'd say don't miss it, but I honestly don't care if you read it or not. I opened the door, letting in a gust of cold December air. Merry Christmas, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your dinner. As I walked down the driveway to my rental car, my phone rang again. The Washington Post. I answered it. Behind me, through the windows of the estate, I could see my family still frozen at the table. My father had sat back down heavily, his face buried in his hands. My mother was crying. Patricia was frantically typing on her phone, probably checking on Harold Finch. Daniel just stared into space. Tyler's wife wasn't whispering anymore. Bradley had left the table entirely, pacing in the corner with his phone pressed to his ear. Mr. Chen, the voice on the phone said, "This is Catherine Graham III, publisher of the Washington Post. I wanted to personally extend our offer. We believe you'd be a transformative addition to our investigative team. I'd like to discuss not just a position, but potentially your own investigative unit with full editorial independence." I got in my car, started the engine, and pulled away from my parents' house. For the first time in 10 years, I felt genuinely free. Not because of the award or the money or the job offers, but because I had finally stopped seeking their approval. My phone continued to ring as I drove. Producers, editors, publishers, politicians. People who recognized the value of what I'd done. People who understood that journalism wasn't about prestige or salary, it was about truth. About holding power accountable. About making a difference in ways that actually mattered. And the truth was, I had never needed my family's validation. I had only needed to keep doing the work that had just made history. As I merged onto the highway toward New York, another text came through. This time from an unknown number. Mr. Chen, this is the office of President Mitchell. The president would like to invite you to the White House next month to discuss your reporting and its impact on healthcare policy. Please advise your availability. A formal invitation will follow. I smiled and kept driving. Some Christmas dinners are worth missing. 3 weeks later, exactly as I had predicted, Patricia called me. Her $40 million deal had collapsed when Harold Finch was arrested on 17 counts of securities fraud and conspiracy. The FBI had frozen his assets, including the escrow for the Riverside Development Project. She was facing potential fraud charges as an associate and possible clawback of her commission. Her engagement to Bradley was off. Apparently, his fund had significant exposure to Meridian Pharmaceuticals, and he was too busy managing his own crisis to worry about hers. I didn't answer. Daniel's law firm had represented several of the pharmaceutical companies I'd exposed. They were now facing malpractice lawsuits, client defections, and federal investigations into their role in facilitating the price-fixing scheme. The firm had to lay off 30% of their partners to stay solvent. Daniel was among the first to go. Catherine filed for divorce the following month. He sent me a long email apologizing for years of mockery and asking if I could put in a word for him at the journalism organizations now courting me. He mentioned that he'd always secretly admired my courage. I deleted it. Cousin Miranda, the Wharton MBA student who had quoted poverty line statistics at me, reached out on LinkedIn with a request to connect. Her message mentioned that she was now writing her thesis on the economics of impact journalism and would love to interview me. She didn't apologize for Christmas. She just wanted access to my story for her own academic benefit. I ignored the request. Uncle Harold called my office 3 times. My assistant told me he sounded increasingly desperate each time. Apparently, his boring pharmaceutical investments had been heavily weighted toward the companies I'd exposed. His retirement portfolio had lost 60% of its value in the weeks following the indictments. He wanted to know if I had any advance warning about which companies might be targeted next. I never called back. My parents, meanwhile, discovered that 3 of their closest friends, fellow country club members with whom they'd vacationed, dined, and socialized for 20 years, had been investors in the pharmaceutical scheme. 2 were indicted. The 3rd fled to a country with no extradition treaty. The social fallout was severe and immediate. Invitations stopped coming. Memberships were quietly revoked. Their annual New Year's gala was canceled when half the guest list suddenly became unavailable. The Georgian manor that was supposed to impress suddenly felt very empty. Their embarrassment of a son had become a national hero, and their successful, impressive social circle had become a liability, a network of criminals and fraudsters exposed by the very person they had dismissed. In May, I stood on the stage at Columbia University, accepting the Pulitzer Prize in front of 700 people. The president had sent a video message of congratulations. 3 Supreme Court justices were in attendance. My investigation was being called the most impactful journalism of the decade by every major outlet that had once rejected my applications. My family wasn't there. They hadn't been invited. As I looked out at the audience, my editor who had taken a chance on me when I was nobody, my sources who had risked everything to help me, the whistleblowers who had provided documents at great personal cost, the colleagues who had believed in me when my own family wouldn't, I felt no regret. These were my family now. The people who had supported me when I had nothing. The ones who saw value in truth when everyone else saw failure. The ones who never once asked about my salary or mocked my apartment. I raised my award to the crowd. This, I said, is for everyone who was ever told their work didn't matter. For everyone who was dismissed, underestimated, or laughed at for pursuing something meaningful.
Keep going.
The work speaks for itself. Eventually, always, the work speaks for itself. The standing ovation lasted nearly 3 minutes. Afterward, I was surrounded by well-wishers, senators who wanted to shake my hand, journalists who had inspired me as a young reporter, activists whose causes had been vindicated by my work. A pharmaceutical executive who had turned whistleblower embraced me with tears in his eyes, thanking me for giving him the courage to come forward. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown Connecticut number. I glanced at it. "We're watching. We're so proud of you. Please call us. Mom and Dad." I read it, considered it for a moment, then slipped my phone back into my pocket without responding. Pride that only came after success wasn't pride at all. It was opportunism dressed in family clothing. And somewhere in Connecticut, in a house that was no longer invited to the best parties, a family watched the ceremony on television. In silence. Just like I had sat in silence at their table for 10 years. The difference was I had been silent because I didn't need their validation. They were silent because they had finally realized they had been wrong about everything. And there was nothing left to say.